Yeah, thank you all for being here. And since we are, you guys are experts in the space, it would be great to have an open discussion at the end of each of these presentations. It's Chatham House rules, and I think we can run the Q&A part as a real roundtable, because that's how we make progress. So I hope we're all game with that. So I wanted to take a step back and just start with, thinking about standards. Like, why do they matter? Why are we here? What's the big picture story? Before we, jump into trend and licensing and SEPs and all the good stuff that we're all experts in when we love. So please bear with me, because I think it leads to some important, timely policy questions of our times, not just in the United States, but in the world. So what's the big picture? And I want to say that, I think now we are at this moment in time where, can you all hear me if I move around like this? Is it still fine? It's a small room.
It could be that
for the recording,
the virtual people won't hear you now.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just move around like this. So I think that we all now know, but let's just put a pin on this, that governments around the world now have embraced the importance of standards. It used to be this esoteric topic that we wouldn't hear about or know about or learn about, but I mean, literally, there are Wall Street Journal articles about the importance of standards now. And we know that, the US we have NIST in the room, for example. NIST has acknowledged the importance of, this common language or common technology that is created. European Commission has a standardization strategy, right? China has a China 2035 standards plan. So there's sort of this embraced recognition. And I love to quote President Xi in a cyber report from Brookings, and this is important because he says something along the lines of, whoever leads in the standards leads in the world, because these are the foundational technologies that other things are built on. So there is that recognition now. And I think that's important to clarify. And it goes beyond, the cellular stuff that we all usually talk about, 5G, it's IoT, connected cars, AI, and all types of tech standards, technology standards. And why not, right? I think there are two primary reasons for it. One is economic, right? The economy of scale that it provides, the foundation pillars of economy that they become, because these are some numbers on economic impact of 5G, on economic impact of AI from these third-party reports like IHS and PricewaterhouseCoopers. But we know that these very important technologies are driven by engineers from your companies coming together and creating a new technology at the frontier, not just determining the common language, but coming up with new ideas that didn't exist before for new technical requirements. And those are some examples. Industry verticals are now changing because they can implement these standards as they always have. Just the footprint is much bigger now. And then there's the other reason that has made this discussion useful, sometimes interesting, sometimes polarized. But here it is, these technologies, because they sit on the foundation, are also fundamental for national security, for what the Europeans would say tech sovereignty, right? There are reports by CNAS here, by NATO and others, who are talking about like the importance of cellular standards, specific applications of cellular standards in autonomous 5G clusters in the battlefield, or reduced external interference, and reducing the probability of perception in the battlefield. Those are some, like, as I sit at CSIS, as the CEO, Dr. Hamby, likes to say, small n, small s national security, like very specific to literal combat battlefield. But there is a bigger story, obviously, for national security with capital N, capital S. And that is not just that economic growth story, but more specifically, you need to know how this technology is developed. You need to know the requirements. You need to know how position location is done, how lawful intercept is done, how very specific technical things are done at this underlying technology level that all products are implementing, right? Same thing for AI, right? Like the cybersecurity system or the monitoring types of applications that AI provides and connected and autonomous vehicles is literally the infrastructure of the future. So let's drive that point home that those are the two things that really make the standards quite pertinent today as important, like country level priorities. So that to me is the big picture where any of this conversation should begin, right? Like, what's the goal here? Why do we need to lead in standards? How do we lead in standards? And what do we do to get there? Oh, by the way, the third reason I should have mentioned is sustainability. I always overlook this reason, but it has become important to countries, geographies. Sustainability and bridging the digital divide are real goals for some fora, some nations, some regions. And there is real evidence for, again, 5G, AI, fixed wireless access type applications of standards, direct applications that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth. So that's another reason, if you will. So why do they work? I think they work because, as you know, these standards are global in nature, right? They provide scale for any company, any product around the world to implement these technologies. And I think that's sort of an important feature that I feel we might lose sight of in these conversations sometimes. The reason standards, the global world is really important in the way these things are developed is, I think, twofold. One is they enable a market of innovation coming from everywhere, right? Nobody has monopoly over good ideas. No country, no firm, no region. So it's important that you create a system of collaboration that is global, that allows anybody who wants to invest in these technologies to participate and create the best possible technology for the consumers. And the second is simple and very sort of basic economics, right? Economy of scale. Why would a company invest in going to these bodies and contributing their technology, literally contributing their intellectual property, their blood and sweat into these things that become global standards if they weren't global, if the scale is suddenly reduced? That means the ultimate revenue pie suddenly reduced. Like I like to think of participation as like standards as when a company at a super high level strategy level is deciding, and may not be like rationally thinking about it in exactly this way, but really you're deciding between, okay, should I create a system that is closed and I have this technology for myself, I can control it. So think of it like a pool that you can own, like a swimming pool. Or should I contribute my technology to an ocean and enable a much larger ocean, but I get a smaller piece of it in return because I can't control an ocean? And the ocean better be so large that that small contribution is enough for you to be equal to or more than this, this other alternative of just developing and owning a technology or having a little pool for yourself, right? So that's obvious that the scale is really important. And just to drive the point home, I thought I'll share with you some data. This is China's market share in 2025, because a lot of these conversations about should these standards be global or not ultimately whittle down to China versus the US or versus the rest of the world. So just remember that it's a big market. It's for 2025 smartphones, a quarter of the smartphones of the world are shipped from China, and 83% connected cars are there. So it's a big market. Okay, I think moving on, you all know this. How are these standards developed, right? Like at a very high level, 3 stages, 10 plus years in advance, companies have to do some kind of R&D, some kind of end-to-end systems design, thinking of, okay, what does the system look like? What are the different protocols, algorithms, etc., that would make this new set of requirements that the industry needs work? Now, I know cellular well, so I'll just give an example from there, right? Like when it was the days of 4G, it was, at a high level requirements of, okay, 100 megabits per second, this much delay, this much jitter, etc. Right? Like it's just it's defined at a top, and then you have to think of, okay, how do I make this work as a community of engineers? For 5G, the three at a very high level requirements were ultra high broadband. So it isn't just high speeds, but it's also super low latency and super high reliability, and also very dense networks. I feel like you all know this. Most of you are experts in these fields, but assuming some who are not and those online, I thought I should just give this simple example of requirements, and then the engineering community is chasing those requirements. It isn't like, oh, should I drive a car from on the left side or the right side of the road? It's not just about interoperability. It's literally about chasing new requirements that the industry is setting, that the market is setting, and coming up with technology to meet them there. So that's why you start 10 plus years in advance. That's why you go to these, global standards bodies. You tinker around with the tech with many other engineers from many other companies. You create these technology standards in a room full of, hundreds of rooms like this. This is a small room for any one standards meeting. And then you deploy products out in the commercial world and so on. So there is a timeline here, and it's may be obvious, but it's worth mentioning that as you go from here to here, you can obviously see that the risk reduces, right? So early on in any timeline of any new technology, risk is high. Later on, as time goes on, more variables become known, the risk reduces. So I think that's worth remembering in terms of how the system is supposed to work, and why R&D is important. And when you talk about licensing, you have to talk about licensing in the context of innovation, right? Because it is a cycle. You do R&D, you go out, you have products, the product is intellectual property, ideas. Those ideas go into different products, increase the manufacturer's revenues, increase the ARPU for the operators, increase the consumer surplus. If they don't, then there won't be a return back on the investment. There will just not be one. You can create a product, and if nobody wants it, you will not get any revenues, right? It's that simple. So you better be creating something that the world needs, and the world needs a lot of scale. And you better be pricing it in a way that you are able to create some kind of a cycle so that you can keep the cycle going, right? So that's, I think, the terminology or the framework in which we should be thinking about some of our policy discussions later. But the story is broader than just intellectual property and licensing. So give me a minute here. But I did want to share with you this picture of a very obvious picture of, how this whole thing is tied together, right? Like there are many people from different parts of this picture in the room, and it has to be working in connection with each other. Now, let me now switch gear. We just went back into the world of licensing that I know that many of you in the room are really quite familiar with, coming from IP Business Congress and so on, but we're connecting dots here. So I would go back to the importance of standards today to countries and to regions. And given that that is the case, you see that I'm taking an example of 5G standards. I'm taking an example of 3GPP, the standards body where 5G standards are developed. And you see here that the number of members, this is just the number of members, not how much they're showing up. You want to interject now?
Line also increased along with the USA and E. It's just kind of covered. I can't see the legend. Sorry.
Oh, this thing is here. How do I?
Lovely.
They're just others. But thank you, because I think we might have missed a couple of other important things there. So the participation is increasing, right, across regions. Of course, I think it's interesting to note that some regions have really increased their membership than others, China being one here. The United States is still at the top. EU is still at the top in terms of membership, in terms of showing up, in terms of driving these standards. But there's also a lot of posturing happening, right? Like in terms of the number of delegates, like China, I think it's worth a quick mention because you see that gray line there, that's China, right? Like it's a ramp up like real fast. And I think that's confirmed by the number of delegates sent to the meetings, by the number of hours, and so on and so forth, that data. But again, like the big picture here is that geographically, it's US and EU who have been participating for a long time, Japan and Korea staying stable, China catching up fast, and others are in a stable position too. Now, because of this posturing, and because of the importance of these standards in a geopolitical sense, there has been a bit of a frenzy to determine who's the leader in these standards. And there's a whole bunch of data out there. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this and unpack it today. And I think we should the industry needs to set some ground rules for how do we deal with this kind of data. And we have good economists in the room. And this is going to be a challenging and an ongoing question for all of us. Tim has done good work on this. Others have done. John here has done some good work on this. There are powe is here. But I think we are not done yet, because this frenzy is creating, in a way, too much noise, and the signal to noise ratio is weak right now. So while there are all these different reports out there about patenting activities by companies developing 5G or AI or whatever, because of the posture which is required for a number of reasons that are beyond simple reasons of licensing, the data is very noisy, and then it is interpreted in a way that could be very misleading. So very simple example, and I can go into as many layers of depth as you want on this as a PhD economist, but at a very simple level, right? Like indicators, like, who said, I think Einstein said this, everything that can be counted, everything that counts cannot be counted, and everything that can be counted doesn't count. So this is a perfect example of something like this, right? So you have in the patent data, and those of us who have studied it in our thesis and all this, there are really only so many observable characteristics in patent data. How many patents firms have, where have they filed them, how many office actions, how long it took to prosecute them, what's the number of technology areas they covered, how many claims they have, right? Like you can come up with 5 or 6 or 7 super novel indicators, how many citations they received, how many citations they made to others. But at the end of the day, it can be a compass that can guide you a little bit somewhere, but like some people have done even things like just doing patent counts and weighted counts. Here's a very easy explanation for why that doesn't work. You don't need to be a PhD economist to understand it, right? Like I have coins in my pocket, you have coins in your pocket, and we are counting the coins to determine who has more money without paying any attention to the denomination of the coins. I can have 100 pennies and you can have a $1 coin, and it's completely useless exercise. So the patent community of the innovation economists, like Zvi Grilikis was, Harvard economist who started the innovation economics field, if you will, like the NBER project on the patent data for the first time in the early 1980s. Before that, nobody was studying the patent data. And there are papers that basically show that, this is my last bullet, right? Like long-standing of economic literature shows that patent counts are very misleading indicators of any terms of quality or output of innovation. They just don't work. This is well known in the literature in economics. It has also been shown that, maybe citation weighted counts are slightly better, but they have limitations too. So at the end of the day, posturing plus, simple methods is leading to what I call an inflation problem in this universe of understanding standards leadership, which is that's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for all of us in any field that we're reflecting in. So now, can I take a pause from the slides and just talk for a few minutes, because there are some certain things I just wanted to discuss, and it's better said than shown. So I hope that at least by now we're all on the same page, or maybe we already were, that standards are important. They're important for geographies, for companies, for countries. They're important for consumers because if imagine, you as a consumer could be living in a world on the left-hand side where these, standards or these technologies that are at the foundation level are being created by a diverse ecosystem of companies. They're designed to pick the best technology and deliver that to you in interoperable products that cover the world. Or you could be living in a world, and by the way, you do for some product on the right-hand side, where there is a proprietary technology that is owned by a vertically integrated company, a single company that controls the gateway to further innovation. And I know you have all examples of those products that you use every day in your lives. So there are limits to that, right? So you as a consumer are also better off on this picture rather than this picture. And there are, economists who have studied this a little bit more detailed and explained why a model for open innovation where 1,000 flowers can bloom, let's call it that, is a better model for the long run for society. Okay, so if we can establish that, then what are the problems today that stand in the way of being there and continuing to innovate through the world of standards, through the institutions of standards? So I see those as threefold problems. And I didn't have slides for that. I thought about it, then I thought it's just best to talk about this. Okay, so number one, I already shared with you, is posturing. Posturing by firms, by countries, by regions to say, I'm the leader. And that puts a lot of data in the mix, and that creates disincentives for different players to participate in these standards bodies. Because now there is noise in the system, there isn't signal, and you don't know who's contributing how much and what's really happening. That can create disincentives if they're misused. Number two is gamesmanship. Can I quickly have a show of hands if there are people who are familiar with the standards world? Have you heard stories of gamesmanship in the standards institutions sometimes, like misusing some rules? Okay, I see some hands. I see many hands. Misusing some rules of governance in the standards bodies towards private gains. And that becomes a real problem in certain circumstances because the incentives are there, given how important these things have become, right? But the institution has to become immune to the gamesmanship. And the problem is that if it doesn't, we won't have a level playing field, not between countries, most importantly, but then also between companies by definition. I just wanted to say something that keeps skipping my mind. This gamesmanship issue can only be fixed by strong governance principles and standards. And I hope, Eustace, you're going to talk about this. You've done a lot of work on governance. Like, what are the rules of the game to participate in these standards institutions that must be held sacred, for a lack of a better word, right? Like immune to these kinds of games. So governance rules have suddenly become really important. And I was hoping that my colleague Walt Copan, who used to be a director of NIST, would be here today. He has to be in Arizona for some award ceremony, because I think, people like Gordon and others at NIST can play a huge role in making sure that the governance rules get the due attention that they need today, that they haven't received in the past, because it is an esoteric topic, but the significance of it is high. And okay, so the first reason was posturing. The third, or threat, I should say, threat to the standards institutions. Posturing, second was gamesmanship, and third is, I'm going to call it bifurcation, but it means moving away from a world of global standards to a world of bifurcated standards in different regions. And that's going to be a problem, as we discussed, because you lose scale. of innovation and you lose scale of market. And this means that this method of innovation will just become less attractive. Okay, so those are the challenges. What are the solutions? And this is what I hope we will discuss in the ensuing discussion. The momentum says Q&A go and throughout the day. But I think, for me, the three pillars that come to mind is, number one, strong, clear governance principles that limit or disable any gamesmanship, that limit or disable any changes in the rules exposed without consensus, without openness, without transparency, majority voting, etc. The second is this posturing thing that we discussed, right? Like, we have to disincentivize posturing, inflating counts, inflating, looking at data in a way that says, oh, this is how you determine 5G leadership. I think that can be really damaging at a high level beyond these licensing quibbles to determining incentives to come to the table and innovate, right? And the third thing, to maintain global standards, we've got to, move away from this direction of creating, region-specific or region-led standards that can really erode, again, the value of these institutions. So I hope that these are the three things we will talk about. We will talk about, IP stuff all day long, so I leave that out of my list. But that was all I had to share.
We have some minutes of Q&A. So any questions to Kirti about her presentation, any comments, anything? Q&A is the keyword, just so you know. Please.
What kind of rules are you talking about? Regulation, as we were talking yesterday in the conference, by countries? Or are you talking about 3GPP governing rules, or what rules? Regime, which rules area? Is it all or one portion of it?
Great. And I would invite my colleague Gordon from NIST to get into the more details of that. And Gordon, I'll just prompt you. Basically, by governance rules, like standards organizations, each standards development organization has its own governance principles. And then at a high level, there is a document with a ridiculously esoteric name called OMB Circular 119. I don't know why it's called. You don't think it's esoteric?
I wrote that document.
The document is great, but maybe you can give it a more fancy name this time.
Standards development organizations are not monolithic. Each one has their own participation consensus rule structure. It has to do with how you determine who leadership, what the role of leadership is, how contributions in the standards process are handled, how negative comments or counter contributions are handled, and how you come to consensus in the actual publication of the standard. There are national participation models broadly. ISO, IEC, ITU. There's some differences here because ISO and IEC are private sector organizations. ITU is a government membership body under the United Nations. There are direct participation models like ASTM. Many U.S. domiciles have direct participation, where instead of having a country-based balance, they use a what are you interested in? Are you the manufacturer of the product? Are you the purchaser of the product? Are you the regulator of the product? Are you a consumer? Kind of balance in the system. And then there's organizations who use other kinds of models like 3GPP and IPTF that are just different. And I think that's what Kirti is referring to, is all the models are okay, but all the models need to be robust enough so no single interest in bullying their way through the system. How was that?
Perfect. And I think that's the point. Like, every standard has its own model, and then at the top, this esoteric name document has to, give guiding principles to everybody. And to make it more robust, maybe, is the ask here, Gordon, to make it more, I don't know, enforceable is the wrong word, but somehow soft enforcement.
So part of the problem is we have a private sector-led standard system. That's part of the beauty of standards. But it also means that the government doesn't get to decide. The participants get to participate, volunteer, and influence the system. that's not a call to action. I don't know what is.
So that's it. So that's the challenge, right? I mean, that's why this governance thing is a challenge. How do you make sure that all standards development organizations have governance principles that are robust from these gamesmanship when, there is no one mechanism to ensure that. So I think there are ways to get there, and that's a next level discussion on how we can get there through some processes. I think I saw some other name.
We had one question here first and another one there, but
Joachim, I
Joachim, you
think
can
I
go
saw
first.
you.
I have two questions. One is that splitting in the air here, for these private and it's just a distributed ownership, but it's owned here, it's owned on free and free standard. It also means the other point is building on.
Stop there for a second. I don't believe 4G is a proprietary standard.
I mean,
Does anyone else agree with that?
like, maybe the definition of question of proprietary.
It's an open standard. It's created under open standard.
No, it doesn't. It's so for example, an iOS is a closed proprietary system. Microsoft Windows is closed proprietary system. Facebook is a closed proprietary system because nobody else can develop that technology. But 5G, anybody can develop that project, or 4G. That's the distinction.
But it's the wording thing.
No, it is more than that actually, Joachim, because the whole, let's go back to 101, basics. It's always good to go back to the basics. Why was the patent system designed? It was designed for giving the incentive to the inventor to disclose their idea to the world so that anybody can use that idea in return for a temporary right to exclude, temporary. But if they don't get that, they have no incentive to disclose their idea to the world. And in fact, there are many innovations that you live with, including some in your pocket, in which the idea is not disclosed to the world and will not be disclosed ever, right? And the standards are not proprietary by definition because, or intellectual property or patents are not proprietary by definition because anybody can use them. They are in the public domain of knowledge. That's how I look at it. Did I get it right?
It's maybe a wording thing, but the distinction, I mean, a patent is not in the public domain, obviously.
A patent is in the public domain. You can go to the US Patent Office and look at the patent.
Knowledge is, but not the right to use it. That's the distinction, I mean, but anyway, I think
That's right. And that's the distinction that allows or incentivizes inventors of some ideas to disclose that knowledge to the public. They don't have to.
You could talk about openness in two dimensions, the openness to participate in the development of it, and openness to distribute it. And of course, it is rather open compared to proprietary, which you don't use at all. But you have it open under brand terms. So that's the trade-off for having a system.
Although I think there's even a third dimension. Yeah, I think there's also openness, not in the third dimension being the governance. Because that's also an issue that we saw, I think, with the IEEE patent policy change that people complained about is that open, transparent consensus based under the TBT, WTO TBT principles. A lot of times people that think that only applies to the development of standards. I think to Kirti's point, potentially, is not just the development of standards, but then taking it up a level is to the governance as well. And then that goes to what sort of SDO do you have? Some SDOs are majority-based governance, others are consensus-based governance. Same thing with the development of it. How do you define consensus? Is it lack of sustained objection? Is it more than 75%? So there's a variety, but I think you have multiple dimensions of
openness, but at least it's open. I mean,
Right.
We are even discussing, is it open or not? And let's get clarity on that basic distinction here.
We have one more question here.
Well, then I would just say, Chuck Fish from Technical IP, I would just say there's a long running discussion of open, like in the sense of open source software, which we're not talking about here, right? We're not talking about free as in free beer, right?
Right.
We're talking about open that context exists and it's adjacent to what we're talking about, but I don't think that's what we mean by open. But the comment that I wanted to make with regard to governance, I think it's a really good discussion to have and to develop principles. I would hope that at the end of the discussion, we can all agree that we don't need, say, a FINRA for standards or something like that. No, I mean, if you're going to talk about governance, how do you get there in the model that you were mentioning?
Gordon
It's
has,
private,
yeah. You know,
like
there
a
are
private
ways
role.
like if you have an interagency process, some language in the legislation, all of those different mechanisms can have
Sure.
as tools.
And I think we might be able to take analogs from other places. So the governance movement that has taken over public companies didn't exist 30 years ago. And it's a private set of systems, but the ecosystem itself, that is the market, helped force changes in general corporate behavior off of a general set of principles, and the market spoke. That is, we're going to adopt A and not B. We're going to buy A's stock and not B's stock. If we don't get sufficient transparency, and if we don't believe there's a common set of rules and government principles that do it. So I look at the way in which analogs from other areas have definitely applied to create change, right? Corporate social responsibility, another huge movement where you got agreement on a set of principles, and then people voted with their dollars to participate or not, help drive that change.
So I'm glad somebody mentioned stocks, and you're absolutely right. We need ultimately the industry to determine the standards for governance, just like, you know, otherwise it doesn't become a movement. But just quickly utilizing your segue into the other discussion of what's open and what's not. I mean, come on, at the end of the day, if anybody is investing in any technology development, they have to be monetized, right? That's basic. You have stockholders, you have, you know, you have certain responsibilities to your, you're not doing this out of the goodness of your heart. I mean, some people are, but that's not exactly the model of innovation that 99% of the companies in the world are following, and especially the ones that are driving technology today, because it requires hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in investment, period, right? Basic stuff. So, so there are two ways to monetize your ideas. I guess there are many, but two broad ways. One is you take your idea, you protect it, you license it, you let anybody use it, but this is how you get return on that investment. The other way is you protect it, you develop a product for it, you don't let anybody use it, you become vertically integrated, and that's how you make money. So those are the open versus closed I'm talking about. I think at a fundamental level, that distinction is very important to clarify.
We had a question here, and just two more questions because we have to go on with the panel that discusses all that in the panel. Please go ahead.
Of the international technology. And I just want to build on what Jim Harlan mentioned, the application of TBT. We're talking about government secrets and politics principles that I think very much reflected in the OMB circular A119, but also
The great document.
Section 5 is a permanent document. Section 5 is the SEO-AA legislation, which actually states that those principles apply to the IPR policy for SEOs. So if you're looking for rules of the game, sincerely, when you're talking about global standards, you're talking about international trade. When you're talking about international trade, you've got WTO, and we do have these TBT.
Yes.
Many SDOs state expressly that they comply with those. So if we're looking at a higher level principle-based government system, that would be the ideal, I think, starting point. And I'd be interested to